The voice. Wonderful. Okay. Good morning to everyone and welcome to History Matters. And coffee really does, by this point in the semester, matter a lot. Today, as advertised on Twitter, we're going to be talking about anger and change. There's a lot to say about that in a lot of different ways, so we'll see how this comes together this morning. Important topic, but big topic. But before we go into that topic, as ever, I must turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. We're excited to have you. Rules of the game are as follows. Please make sure to use chat as much as you possibly can. We do like hearing from all of you, and we will look forward to your comments. We discovered this last week after 80 some weeks. One of the nice things about seeing the show live and actually coming to the show via the website is you get to participate in chat and see what all the great comments are and how amazing our community is. So please use chat. As always.
Interrupt for a moment only because you reminded me of a thing that I think is worth saying since I'm always excited about it, which is that this is the 83rd straight episode.
Isn't that incredible?
Okay, now I'm sorry. Go, my
I
partner.
know, it's incredible. I'm like floored by it every time.
No, me too.
Please use chat, and then we will look forward to hearing your comments, or seeing your comments rather. But as always, please keep it germane to the conversation as much as possible, and of course, family friendly. If you do have questions for Joanne, make sure to put them in Q&A. That's where we like to take questions. It helps me keep it straight because I am getting old. So that way I don't lose anything in chat. So please put that in Q&A, and I will take as many questions for Joanne at the end as possible. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can go to our website at www.ncheteach.org and check out our website. We have lots of great content, adding to it daily, it feels like, because our website is growing. We have lots of good stuff, everything from resources to webinars to colloquia. Right now, we have colloquia registered. We have, in the coming weeks, we're going to be having our latest Library of Congress grant publicized, featuring rural schools. And then finally, we are going to, in 10 days, we get to finally reveal our National Endowment for Humanities grant, landmarks grant at NASA, called the Space Race on the Space Coast. And it's going to be wonderful. So look forward to that. So we're doing great things here, so please join us and check it out, because our goal is to bring as much history and history education to your world as possible, and we're just grateful for your participation here today. With that, turn it back over to Joanne Hideaway, and we will engage in some talk about anger.
Okay, so every week, as I said before, I try really hard to come up with something that in some way or another feels either immediate to me or relevant in some way that's significant, or sweeping enough that talking about it with a historical context will do some good. There's a little bit of all of that, I would say, today. As ever, Thursday is the first day of the week when I get to sit down and think about this. I was earlier than I normally am this week. I posted it Thursday morning because anger came to me as a topic because I was thinking about Tuesday's election or elections. And I was thinking about all of the ways in which anger was ricocheting around surrounding the elections happening, particularly in Virginia, the governor's race in Virginia. There was a lot of anger raising about a wild threat that isn't a wild threat, like somehow crazy teaching of critical race theory in K through 12, which is not happening. But there was a lot of discussion of that, and that got a lot of people riled up and angry. And I'm not one to, say, well, because of that, this happened. As a historian, you can never make those kinds of absolute connections. However, that was certainly an effective use of getting people angry about something to motivate action. So that was part of what I was thinking about anger this week. Then I acknowledged the fact that I was watching different races in different states and becoming angry. And if you go back and look at what I was tweeting that night, I think I sent out a tweet that said something like, and now I am clenching my jaw, so it is time to go to bed, because I was feeling anger. So you put those two things together and I thought, okay, let's talk a little bit about anger, anger in politics. And I labeled this episode actually anger and change, because I don't want this to be a dead-end conversation suggesting, wow, we're all angry. I looked around a lot online today in preparation for this episode. There are a lot of articles, op-eds, magazine articles, that in one way or another say, wow, we sure are angry. And that's not what I want to do this morning. We are, but acknowledging that goes nowhere. Does nothing other than say, uh-oh, essentially, uh-oh. And if you're going to present an uh-oh, if you're going to present a problem, if you're going to present a dilemma, you at least have to offer a sense of other ways to go that would be positive. And as I've said time and time again in our 83 episodes, in moments like the present, I know someone playing bingo is going to be really happy about this, in moments of extreme contingency, when there can be dramatic changes possible, that can mean several things. One thing that can mean is a dramatic change for the worse, right? And the threat of really smacking at or destroying democracy, the threat of authoritarianism, or during that kind of moment of real extreme change, contingency, there can be positive change. That can be a moment when, if you're alert and aware and willing to voice what you're thinking and willing to join up with others and think about the moment and think about what can happen, that positive change is possible. It's so similar to the period I normally really focus on, which is the 1790s. And I've said this a zillion times, that in ethos and mood, the 1790s bears a lot of similarities to the present, particularly along the lines of what I'm discussing now, which is it was heightened emotions of all kinds, because no one knew what would happen. No one knew if the experiment in government that the United States launched was going to survive. It was the first decade that it existed. And people thought either it's going to go downhill fast and maybe it will slip right back into monarchy, or maybe it will move into anarchy, or maybe there will be civil warfare. Who knows? It could be bad. But on the other side, people were willing and eager to think about the fact that maybe we're doing something new and valuable here. Maybe we can really push here to do something that hasn't been done before in this way, and that will move government in a different direction. But if you're living in a moment when both of those things are really true, that's a moment of really fraught emotion, like the one that we're in now. So we've talked about fear, we've talked about hope, we've talked about, what was the other thing we talked about? Fear, hope, and there was a third emotion, hate. Right, hate, fear, and hope. Hope is important in there, all with the same motive in mind that I have at the moment, which is, in this moment of extreme emotion, let's talk about how people are using these emotions to have political impact, how we can think about and witness that deployment of emotion to understand what's happening, and how we can wrestle with and use our own responses to the moment in a way that moves towards the good, how we can take advantage of the moment that we're in to not feel hopeless, to not feel powerless, but to feel that we can be energized and activated and actually do something for the good. Now, anger, I really had a tricky time sitting down this morning, deciding how I wanted to talk about this. I initially sat down and tried to make a list at first of like things anger can do. This did not lead anywhere. I'll read the beginning of my list, but this this is not how I'm going to proceed. It's like, well, anger. Okay, well, anger, you can use anger to repress other people or to suppress other people. I thought about my most recent book with the Southerners basically threatening Northerners or anti-slavery people into silence. You can use anger to make demands. You can use anger to just vent your feelings, right? Which is not necessarily bad. You can use anger to motivate, which can be good or bad. And the line between good and bad is going to be one of the things that I think is probably going to come up more than once today. Anger can be a motivator for protest. Once again, that raises issues about good and bad, and good protest and bad protest, and when is it justified and when is it not. And one thing I also will be talking about shortly is the racial divide in who's allowed to be angry. I'll come back to that shortly. But at any rate, anger can do a lot of things. In a sense, as much as hate is a powerful motivator, that, as I mentioned during that episode, which you can find archived online at this same link, and I talked about how it gets past evidence and it gets past logic and it gets past argument, something like hate or fear. It pushes you past all of those things into a kind of guttural response, which is hard to argue with. And you could say that, in a sense, anger is similar, can be similar, but hate as a motivator or fear as a motivator isn't quite the same as anger as a motivator, because of the shadings, I think, of anger and the ways in which there's righteous outrage, right? And I realize that that can be shaded in so many different ways to so many different causes, but it's something that has been assumed from the beginning of American governance. It will be in there. It will be in the mix. So what do we do about it? Not surprisingly, when I sat down and thought about where in history am I going to go to discuss this, well, one of the people I thought about was Alexander Hamilton, because his letters exist in a file card box in my head. So the one that occurred to me this morning was not necessarily a letter, but a statement that he makes during the arguments over the Constitution, Federal Convention, and along the lines of what I said a few minutes ago, people are thinking that maybe this is a new kind of politics we're initiating, that it won't be based on force, but it'll be based on reason. Hamilton, in the first paragraph of the first Federalist essay, says something along these lines, and much more articulately than I just said it. So maybe something good is happening here, and maybe we'll be able to see government acting better and for better purposes, and the people engaging with it in a better way. And Hamilton, who is always sort of a brass tacks, I don't know, realist, pessimist, well, you can fill in that word, had no assumption that humankind was going to behave well or better given that there was a new government. So when he talks about government and what government should do, he essentially says, people are going to be passionate. And by passionate, he meant angry, outraged, afraid. They're going to have strong emotions and not necessarily useful emotions. So the trick of government, according to Hamilton, is you need a government that can channel those emotions in a useful way, ideally, or at least in a not harmful or less harmful way. To Hamilton, that's part of why government needed to be strong. And I'm not necessarily saying I agree with everything Hamilton says, but his idea that one of the things that a good government can do is channel extreme emotions in such a way that it protects the process of government, sort of allows things to continue going, even if they need to be revised, changed, even dramatically. That seemed to me like an important starting point for our discussion today. Government can channel emotions, and channeled emotions can be channeled towards positive change. All morning, I've also been thinking about the civil rights movement, right? And all of the moments in that moment in time in which people were angry at their right being denied, their many rights being denied, and they voiced that. They voiced that in a lot of different ways. They voiced that in a lot of different forms of protest. They were met often with violence for voicing that. But that, to me, also, in thinking this morning about anger as not always bad, but sometimes good, that was an example that occurred to me. So I want to talk a little bit about anger as a motivator. Obviously, along the lines of what I've said before on other episodes, it's a handy thing in politics. It's a powerful thing in politics, even if it's channeled, like Hamilton said, that helps. But if you can get people angry, unlike hate and fear, which hate might just lead to anger, fear might just get you to run or hide. Anger is a motivator potentially really for action. So particularly during elections, angry people are useful people and potentially really loyal people if you can get people angry in the direction that you want them to be. So politically speaking, anger is very useful. And I think that's not a new realization by any means. You can jog through American history, even beyond the last 40 or 50 years of angry American politics, and you can see that's a long-standing realization. I mean, propaganda, in a sense, is based on that kind of realization. Like, ooh, let's get people riled up, and then they will be loyal to us because we will be the people stepping forward and offering the solution. So it's politically useful, and so it's often comes forth, particularly during elections, particularly at moments when there's a lot at stake, because it's a useful way to steer passions, not necessarily for the common good, but for whatever it is that you yourself want, which might be good and might be repressive. But at any rate, it's useful. It's politically useful. It will always be there. One of the things that's different at this moment in my digging around online, looking at different sort of political science essays and a couple sort of more psychologically oriented essays talking about anger and what anger does. And I just totally forgot where I was going with that because my coffee hasn't kicked in yet. Hang on a sec, folks. It's going to come back. I'm lost and digging around political science and psychological studies. I don't know where I was going. Sorry, folks. I've done this once before in front of a big audience, and I did the dreaded, there are 3 reasons for this, and I got through 2, and then I had jet lag. I was in England, and the 3rd one just never appeared. My apologies. I have great empathy for anyone who does that in public because sometimes your brain just short circuits. At any rate.
You want me to come on and do jazz hands? Would that be helpful?
No,
okay.
This is why coffee is important. This is why coffee really matters. My larger point here, and that I have not lost, is the usefulness of anger in politics. Oh, now I know where I was going. Thank you, brain. What I was thinking about was some of these articles trying to figure out what's different about this moment so that anger feels stronger or is spreading further. It's a point I've made before. It's an obvious point, but it needs to be said again, that propaganda normally is a centralized thing. But now, because of all of the ways in which we can communicate, and social media is part of that, that means propaganda has a much wider reach, it can reach people much more quickly. There's less spin. And for that reason, for all of those reasons, sometimes it's really difficult to tell what is propaganda and what isn't. And we've talked about this before. I've talked about how if there's something that seems like it's deliberately trying to make you really angry, not just reporting something or expressing concern about something, but if your gut response is anger, pause for a moment, because that actually might be all that it's about, and that very well might be propaganda. But there's an article that talks about this very thing, that talks about the ways in which you can yoke anger for political purpose, not just during elections, but again, in ways that seem to be not doing anything underhanded, but that when you track the logic of it, become really interesting. I am not skilled enough at this point to, and Matt, I don't know.
It's ready to go.
It's ready to go. Okay, I sent him a link a few minutes before we went on. There was an essay I found online, and I'm not sophisticated enough to post it in chat while I'm talking to you, but it was particularly interesting because what it did was analyze a news story and it happens to be on the Fox channel, piece by piece, statement by statement, just showing how each statement builds on the other. So it's not, the article is not a diatribe, it's an analysis by a professor of rhetoric, Jennifer, and I might be pronouncing her name wrong, Mercica. I follow her on Twitter, and I engage with her sometimes on Twitter, and I feel horrible not knowing how to pronounce her name. But anyway, I sent Matt the link. What she does is really interesting and is along the lines of what I'm talking about here, which is she just goes statement by statement and shows how each builds on the one before it, leading ideally an audience to have a certain response, and then another certain response, and then a linked certain response. So I encourage you to look at it just because it is along the lines of what I've been encouraging folks to do all along here on History Matters, which is to really think about how people are talking to you in addition to the fact that they're talking to you. It makes this larger point. It shows the use of fear to get people involved, and then it shows the deployment of that fear to get people angry. And ultimately, it leads to, and this is an important distinction, which these articles made, and which I think it's worth noting particularly now, it leads you to believe that you're engaged in a kind of war. And in a war, it's you against the enemy, right? And I think conceiving of politics as a war, in a literal sense, you are the good guys and the people who don't agree with you are the enemy. Politics as war is not a useful way of thinking about politics, right? Politics is in a democratic form of government, a process. That's the point of the process, right? You might not like the process. The process might be deeply flawed. The process might really need to be reformed. There might be, and always in a sense are, all kinds of problems in the process. And that's been true of American democracy from the beginning in a variety of consistent and ever-changing ways. But that said, the fact that there is a process, something to resort to at moments of crisis so that at least you can debate or talk or argue your way out of a moment, that's vital. That's important. That's the assumption about our political system, that at its heart, there is, and debate, I mean that in as broad a sense as possible. Debate, meaning really angry argument if you want, but that there's bumping up of interests and ideas, anger, it can be nasty, but the assumption is that there's exchanging of ideas at the heart of our system, and that exchange, and then allowing us, the public, to weigh in on that exchange, that's democracy, right? Ideas competing, people competing, and then we are the ultimate umpires. That's how things are supposed to work. A politics in which the goal is to get people angry, to see the other side as people to be eliminated, people to be, if you're talking about, and this almost, it's ridiculous that I need to say this, if you're talking about killing people on the other side, you are not talking about democracy. You are not talking about process. You're talking about the elimination of process and the elimination of democracy. So that's an important distinction, that politics as process, politics as competition, politics as argument, politics as, even if you want to say fighting, meaning not physically fighting, but fighting, fiercely arguing and battling with each other over what you want. That's all politics. Politics as war, meaning the other side is the enemy and must be not just defeated, but in the process of defeating them, potentially killed, and those are the stakes of war. That's not democracy. And that's right there, that distinction between anger fueling argument, anger in one way or another, getting people, even if it's against their will, to push towards change, versus anger as kill, crush, destroy. That's a bad versus good argument, very clear. And then there's a kind of gray area in the middle in which people might say, I'm doing this thing that I'm not wearing a mask because it's against my rights, and I'm angry about the fact that my rights are being violated. Now, doing that endangers other people, so that complicates that argument. But you could see someone making that argument, right? It makes me angry that people are trying to get me to wear a mask. Okay, in a functioning democratic society, you could have people engaging about that and arguing about that. And you could also have the realization that we're in the middle of a pandemic So that particular I want is problematic. But at any rate, my larger point here about anger is to think that there are different kinds of anger, and some I think are inherent and essential to the democratic process. And I think the civil rights era and the movement towards political reform so that people of all kinds all have the same rights is a great example of that. The violence that met that, the violence, the killing, the physical violence that met civil rights organizers and protesters is an example of the bad kind of anger, which was basically just saying, shut up, go away, you are the enemy. So I don't have a solution. I don't ever come on here saying that I have a great solution, but I do have an urging, which is to think about the anger that's around you and realize that we can all use this moment to push for change. We can organize, we can vent, we can protest, we can argue, we can come forward in powerful ways to make our demands known, to make our rights known. That's part of the political process in a democracy. And we shouldn't come to this moment and see these people threatening violence or being extreme in some way and assume that our response is to step back and be quiet. That's bullying as politics. That's what I specialize in writing about. That we are at a moment when any kind of change is possible, and we have a right to express what we feel the direction of politics should be. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll close with this, and then I want to open things up for question. It's vital to also consider the fact that in the United States and in many places, white people have a right to be very angry, and Black people do not have that right. Right? An angry Black person is, by definition, for some people, a threat. So if you're Black in America and angry, that's complicated. And that's part of our problem, right? But that needs to be part of this conversation. Because I'm sitting here as a, white woman, I don't know if I want to declare myself elite, but by some circumstances, I suppose I might be, but whatever I am, I'm a white woman saying it's okay to be angry. I don't want to say that without acknowledging the fact that that's much more complicated if you're not white, and it's actually less complicated if you're male versus female. But that's a problem in our process that has to do, and you see a lot of talk online talking about this moment, about demands for allyship, for stepping forward and being with people when they are expressing anger and making demands. Being a white person joining up with Black people at moments when they're angry. I mean, that's using anger to bring people together, as opposed to using anger to drive people apart. As I said, that conversation meandered all over the place. It does suggest, by meandering all over the place, the many ways in which anger can have an impact, positive and negative. But there was so much anger on Tuesday surrounding that election. I guess I ended it and wanted today to be a moment when we could acknowledge that, we could acknowledge that it potentially even had an impact on choices being made in an election, and that we wouldn't respond to that by saying, okay, now we're sunk because everyone's getting certain people angry and they're voting a certain way, and what can we do? That's the goal of anger used that way in politics, to silence, to intimidate, to push aside, to convince people, again, bullying is politics, that they better move aside or they're going to be declared the enemy and bad things will happen. That's not a conversation that should go uncontested. Contesting it and how we do is a good question. And I'm not preaching violence, but I'm also not preaching silence. So I think I'm like meandering way beyond our deadline. So I will stop here. And I already see that Carolee, yes, and Tom now, mug. Okay, so I will indeed reveal the mug. If there's anyone here who has not been here before, every week I do have a mug that's thematically related to whatever we're talking about. This, it's not really a stretch, but it's edited. It's a mug that I used throughout the writing of my book, actually about anger, but I've edited it. it says, right, like a mother, boo. You know what it says under the red slip, but sort of writing in that mood is part of what I'm talking about here in proactive, useful ways of using anger for change. Writing is one of them. And I don't know.
Have known. I would have grabbed mine. I have
one?
Yeah, I have one.
Wow. See, I don't know if at this point, after a bazillion weeks, I have no memory of whether I've used some or not. So I don't know. I would assume I've used this one at some point.
Yeah, but I think that's how I found it, and then I put it in my wish list, and my wife got it for me for Christmas.
Oh, okay. It's been a while though, I think, because it was like in the back of the mug cupboard. That's the only way I can judge. At any rate, okay, so that's check the spreadsheet for, holy smoke, I didn't even know there was a mug spreadsheet.
There is a mug spreadsheet.
I'm not going to go there, but I am going to turn to Matt again. If anyone here is new, there is also always a background related to what we're talking about. So now let us turn to the background.
And before I do the background, I got to say my Darth Vader mug was dirty, but I do have my Stormtrooper mug today. Because unfortunately,
well, those are that's actually more useful because stormtroopers are following the chief evil person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got to thank Joanne for this background because I was at a loss today, and she sent the article that we put in chat. And it refers to Edward Bernays, the early advocate of mass propaganda. So that led me down to, I'm sorry, can I move? Yes. And the big clue is right, let's see, I think I'm gonna have the wrong hand. Yes, right here-ish. There, nope, there. Right there, OWI. So this is the Office of War Information, aka the Propaganda Office during World War II, I believe, from this picture. So this is where they made all the propaganda posters.
Very cool. That's not obvious.
Yeah. OWI, I think I was going to edit that out, but yes, that was the Bruce Banner's office. See, that would have been good. I didn't think about Bruce Banner's office. But
still, that wouldn't have been obvious. I think this is good. This is excellent.
Yeah. So that's what I went with because it was in that article. It's a great article. I'm now following that scholar on Twitter.
Yeah, she's really interesting in her discussion of rhetoric and politics.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to follow another smart person besides yourself. So, all right. So questions. We have 11 questions. And I got to say the audience has been killing it with questions. So I'm really excited about this. And oh, look, it looks like we have some new folks. So I'm always encouraging new people to put in their questions. Don't be afraid. We have a large audience here of 80 some people. And I would encourage you to put in questions that you don't be a lurker, put it in because we like to, even if you think it's a dumb question, it's probably not.
There are no dumb questions.
There are no dumb questions. And we have a terrific smart audience. So
I do have to quote Dale here who wants to know if Bernays also invented a sauce. I couldn't resist. Okay. Questions.
I feel like I need a rim shot now. All right. So Lawrence, speaking of Hamilton's channeling of emotions, could you please address his role in channeling, quote unquote, emotions of the army officers at Newberg in 1783?
So Hamilton, it's a really good question. So Hamilton had, how do I not put this? He always wants a strong national government. Sometimes he wants a really strong national government. Thinking about after Newberg, so if you're thinking about once the national government is in play, he does have an almost knee-jerk response to protests against the government, and he almost always, in one way or another, says maybe we need force, like maybe we need troops, bring in the army, right? So the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton is like, bring in the troops. He says at one point, whenever the government appears, it should appear as a Hercules, right? So he has this sort of assumption that it's useful to call in the military when protest appears to be dangerous to the authority of government. That is not necessarily a safe and cheering thing to assume. And that is something that's kind of consistent. During Newberg, he does sort of hint, he does this at various points with Washington in a variety of different ways too. Like, if we just do this little thing, it'll get people kind of worked up. I don't think he was singularly responsible. And let me explain Newberg for a moment. So the Newberg conspiracy was this assumption at the end of the revolution. There were officers who were upset, soldiers who were upset that they were not getting paid. They were angry, and they were seemingly organizing in some way because they were angry about not being paid. And Washington goes to meet them in person to confront this. He's told about it. He goes to meet them in person. This comes to be known as the Newberg conspiracy, which is to rise up and make demands because they're being treated unfairly. And Washington goes to meet them and really deploys the pathos, right? He does something he's really good at, which is sort of play to the audience with performance. I always joke with my students that, man, Washington's glasses, he gets up in front of these angry soldiers, officers, and has something he wants to read, speech he wants to read. And he says, wait, before I can read, I need my glasses. I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. that's man. And it's a little known, but true fact about early national politics, particularly in this time period, 1770s, 80s, and 90s, men crying, a lot of men crying at these kinds of moments. So he says that, and supposedly people in the audience begin to like cry because this is disturbing, and supposedly it passes, that moment passes, blah, blah, blah. Hamilton always, in one way or another, toys with either not even toying, directly wanting to confront protests with force, or just toying with threats as a way to silence protest. Hamilton is someone who outright says that he thinks the American government is too weak. He thinks the British government is the best in the world, and he's going to do everything he can to push the United States towards a British style of government without abandoning small r republicanism as he defines it. And in his mind, that means that the people, they govern, that it's up to the people to make the popular opinion, public opinion, make the choices. But at any rate, that's a very long way of saying that's part of this larger trend of his, which is a trend in American history that obviously goes all the way back to the founding of what do you do? How do you confront protest? And Hamilton, sometimes, particularly in this early period, his response is crush it. So again, there is no one voice in the founding period. There is no one idea. And not every founder is always saying things that are comfortable with the functioning democracy. They're not thinking about a functioning democracy in the founding period in the way that we think of it today. They're just not.
As a follow-up to that, Dale wanted to know, were there instances in the early republic where anger was used for clearly positive change?
Oh, interesting. Anger being used for clearly positive change, other than the civil rights moment you were talking about earlier?
Early, like the early, he's referring specifically to the founding era.
Let me think about founding era. Well, the revolution. I mean, and the revolution, so that's an interesting thing. People felt there was unfairness. People felt that their rights were being violated. They felt that they had no way to communicate their rights being violated. And there's an example of not like, let's kill, crush, destroy, but they began discussing that. Then they began organizing discussions of that. Then they began debating about it. And initially, they wanted to try and use the system as it existed to push towards change. The system had no interest in really, they were petitioning the king and doing whatever it is you're supposed to do as a British subject and being essentially ignored. So the system was malfunctioning. So they're very Americans. I mean, really, Thomas Paine has a role here. Americans are very slow to finally, in the end, abandon the king and abandon the royal system of authority that they're used to. They do that when they feel that there's no other alternative. And even the first moment of real violence, right, Lexington and Concord, we don't even really fully still know who launches that moment of the exchange of fire. So anger certainly fuels protest and a sense of rights violated, which ultimately leads to organization, which ultimately leads to action. And I would say that's a productive way of using anger, and people were really angry. There's a older but still really influential work by Bernard Bailyn, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, which initially was grounded based on a bunch of pamphlets from the Revolutionary era, hundreds of pamphlets from the Revolutionary era, in which everyone was sort of ranting about their fears and anger and what they felt towards the British Empire. And Bailyn, one of the things he did at this early point was, people tend to read that and accuse these people of being paranoid. What if they actually believed this and felt it and were responding based on sincere beliefs? And that plugs into what we're talking about here today as well. You can read those pamphlets, and yes, some of them are being written for rhetorical purposes, to get people motivated, to move them to action, but to dismiss all of that as pure propaganda and not expressing sentiment of the moment is damaging, and really, I think, cuts out an important part of the buildup towards revolution.
Well, it's really interesting because my original background, what I was going to go with today, before you saved me with this much more interesting one, was one referring to Thomas Paine. And would you throw Thomas Paine in that group of people that use anger with the writing of Common Sense? And I know he was given a lot of credit by other founding folks for having a deep influence on the revolutionary period. So when you said revolution, I'm like, I wonder, would you throw Thomas Paine in that group of people that used anger for positive purposes? Or do you think his style was more rhetorical, logical, based in sort of a classical logical argument?
Well, I think strategically, he, Common Sense has a huge impact. But think about the title, right? He's actually kind of suggesting this isn't about anger. Mm-hmm. This is common sense, right? I mean, let's think about what a king really is here, folks. So I suppose in the end, that use of common sense leads people to have stronger emotions, but he probably would not say he was like deliberately using anger. He was doing just the opposite, which is, you know what? You don't have to be angry to realize just the facts here, folks. Pretty straightforward. I think that's part of his logic. And that was really how he pitched that pamphlet, and why it had such a wide readership and such a broad impact, because it didn't come across as angry, screaming rhetoric.
And maybe that's why we tend to remember that one more historically than some of the other pamphlets of the era. So anonymous attendee. So obviously this has to be Beth's granddaughter who asked this question. So that's because I do like to attribute this. So I'm attributing this to Beth's granddaughter, which is, you offered some of the things we could do to combat anger. More specifically, what does history say about how we emerge from these periods more unified? For example, the election of 1800 or after the Civil War.
Well, interestingly, so in both cases, and I know I talk about process so often here, after the election of 1800, the nation is hyperpolarized. Essentially, one of the messages that the winners of that election, the Jeffersonian Republicans, are promoting, and that the Federalists at least pause for a moment to consider, is the process just actually functioned. Seemed like it might not, but it actually did. So now we've had an election and this has happened. So now let's all step back and take a deep breath. And we are all in the same game together. We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. Let's try and move forward. And when you read Federalist letters to each other, there is a little period in which they're like, yeah, okay, let's see. You know, they're not like, yeah, come on into the circle, Jefferson, but they do take a step back from utter outrage. The utter outrage builds up, you know, in not a long amount of time. But my larger point here is process, is that the fact that's pointed to is a lot of things just happened there. It was ugly, it was extreme. People saw each other as enemies. People were organizing guns in case they needed to take the government. For Jefferson, there was a lot of extreme behavior. And then that passes and the system works, which in and of itself really is a strong statement about the political system. And thus now is a moment to step back and reckon with that. And I think after the Civil War, and which is a point that the system could not encompass, right? So that you actually do end up having a real war as opposed to combat within or around a system of government. The system we come back to after the Civil War has shifted. You know, in a sense, there's a different constitution post-Civil War than there is pre-Civil War, because of things that are changed either during or after the war. But again, the assumption is now we're going back to the system, right? The system in play. The fact of the matter is, in one way or another, a democratic government needs to have the faith and acceptance of its people to function. So even though we all acknowledge the many ways in which American government is unfair, unbalanced, favors some people over others, in some ways is undemocratic, we also generally feel that the system itself can be fixed in such a way that it doesn't abandon the spirit of democratic government. It actually enhances and moves closer towards the spirit of democratic government. I think I've talked on here before about there's a spirit of American government and there's the reality of American government, and they are not necessarily meshing very well at all, and probably in one way or another never have. But so I think the system, faith in the system to be able to change the system, all of these things, I think are part of what keeps a democratic government functioning. And I think abandoning the system, violating the system, assuming you're above the system, assuming you're above the law, just, you know, sort of stripping it away, those are not ways to move towards any kind of useful change, because the only change to come of abandoning the system is a lack of system. It's a system organized around people who have power, as opposed to a system that is in place that basically generally people have agreed to the base terms of it, and that you can work within that world, within that circle. That's the most useful thing. I mean, the founders would never have told you that what they did was perfect, but I think one of the things they would agree on is that one of the most important things that the framers did was to create a system of government, a process of government to go back to. So, and a process that was flawed and that could be amended and fixed. The process and how we think of it and deal with it is important. And, you know, that gets back to Hamilton, his idea that things can be channeled in a way that's useful. I say that all the time. I think it's true. And I say that as someone who's fully aware of the many ways in which that process is flawed. But I would rather be in a place where there is at least that starting point than in a place that has no ledge to stand on to work towards better democracy.
Well, there are a lot of great questions about the founding era today. That seems to be a focus. So I'm going to ask one final one from Gloria, who, thank you, Gloria. I know we don't get to you very often, but this is an interesting question. Gloria asks, is Paul Revere's engraving on the Boston Massacre irresponsible, is the word she uses, because it appeals to anger?
It does. For those not in the know, when Paul Revere makes that very famous engraving of the Boston Massacre, he plays up the violence in it being committed against the colonists. Again, to get people riled up. Is it irresponsible? I mean, in that sense, you could say it's propaganda, right? Because he's doing it to get an emotional response. I don't know I'm battling with the word irresponsible.
So was I. That's why I wanted to ask it exactly how she asked it, because I don't think it was, I personally don't think it was irresponsible. I think it was incredibly intentional.
Oh, it was very deliberate. And in that sense, it is propaganda.
Yeah.
And it is propaganda aimed at getting one side to be angry at the other side, you know, so it's in league with, it's in line with the sorts of things we're talking about. This falls into what I said earlier, is that gray area.
Yeah.
In which there's anger raising that is clearly just about silencing people, and there's anger raising that's to enable people to, you know, voice what they feel are their rights, or to make demands in a way that's within the bounds of a system, or certainly around the edges of the bounds of a system. And then there's this gray area in the middle. If you were British and saw that, you would be outraged, right? If you were someone who is not sympathetic to the revolutionary cause, you would see that as base propaganda, the making the British look horrible. So I would say it does fall into the realm of propaganda. I would counter that by saying, thus the importance of the British soldiers involved in the massacre getting a trial, a fair trial, with John Adams representing them as their attorney. So there was propaganda, and then the system actually took over and said, okay, whatever we think what happened, let's figure out what really happened, and let's give them a fair trial. And someone who's very clearly on the side of, you know, the patriots steps forward to help that fair trial happen. That's a great example of the system in operation.
So, oh, it was James Wendell who asked the anonymous question. I still say it was Beth's granddaughter, but we're gonna give it to James.
Okay.
So this is actually a really nice segue into Lawrence's question, which is, please speak to the manufacturer anger as a tactic and authentic anger in response to circumstances or actions by others. Has manufactured anger become so common that it is now standard in the political playbook? And I think, just to reframe this slightly, because we just got done talking about Paul Revere, Thomas Paine, some of these folks that used rhetoric in these very, very specific ways. Can you talk a little bit about this manufactured anger? Was maybe Paul Revere trying to manufacture anger, or was he playing on, or was it a rhetorical device in some ways? And so Lawrence is asking about today, but can we maybe try to use this question to link practices in the past with today?
Well, I think I'll kind of go in two different directions. I think manufacturing anger and being a rhetorical device are kind of together, you know, in what was happening there, a rhetorical device aimed at getting a response. But talking more broadly about the use of manufactured anger, I think I think that's not just American, and it's not just in the last 40 years, like kind of where we started, right? Manufactured anger is really powerful and really useful, and in a sense, really easy to do if you're bolstering that kind of anger with extreme rhetoric or lies or whatever else it is you're doing to create that kind of anger. So yeah, it's always been in play. There is an argument that's made about, I don't know, the last few decades that have been decades when that has been at the center of political playbooks, that anger, that kind of manufactured anger, is actually kind of become a part of politics in an almost official kind of a way. Can't blame it on the last presidential administration. It's far longer in existence than that. I'm definitely not someone who focuses on politics in the 20th or 21st centuries. But I would say, even so, manufactured anger as part of the political playbook, I think now it just is. You know, and many people point to Newt Gingrich and say, well, he is someone who helped kind of push things in that direction. That's a really interesting topic that I think is, there's a lot of books out there that talk about this, about the growth of rage as politics, rage as a process. I think it's been operating that way for a while. I think now we're in a moment where it's not something that's being done in a quiet way or in a subtle way, but it has now become front and center in a way that perhaps it wasn't before, sort of proudly being proclaimed as a principle. And that's put us in a different and potentially dangerous kind of a place.
So we have time for one final question, I think, and this is, so now that we're sort of transitioning into today, I think this is a good way to end the conversation.
Okay.
Miranda asks the question, and thank you, Miranda. I'm going to read the question and then I'm going to slightly reframe it so that it fits with what we've been talking about, which is, her question is, how does the election of the first woman lieutenant governor, a Black woman and an immigrant from Jamaica, such as Winsome Sears in Virginia, change the narrative of identity politics, or does it affect it at all? So, and since we're talking about anger and we're talking about some of the, as you just said, some of the propaganda techniques behind it, and and how that works today, can we talk a little bit about identity politics and whether or not, and the degree to which some of these rhetorical devices, such as using anger, fit into that today and or in the past?
Well, I mean, I do think, if by identity politics, you're just partly talking about race. Mm-hmm. And race and anger and fear and hate are right here at this particular moment in history. And I could certainly go on and talk for a while, we're sort of out of time, about people using identity politics as a wedge, again, as a way to get anger going. I want to end on a more positive note by saying, because initially I thought this is where the question was going, it went in a different direction. Like, what do we make of these people being elected to office? My take on that is also partly having people, diverse people, elected to office through the political system in a position of power, particularly where they haven't been there before, is so important to see, is so important an endorsement of our political system, and is so important to people, diverse peoples of all kinds, to be able to see that even though that happening creates this venue where people can deploy identity politics, or I'm going like out of focus, can deploy, I don't know why, can deploy identity politics in a anger rousing kind of a way. The positive part of that, the fact that you can see that, and the power of being able to see that kind of change happening within the system as it functions, that's a really powerful, important message, no matter how it gets smacked at. That's vital. That's democracy at work. Whether you like that or not, if you're unhappy about the race of the person who's given power, you're unhappy about the race of the person who's given power, but they got that power through the political system in operation. Fair and free elections.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to stop for the day. Still lots of questions available, so we'll have to tackle those during the after party if we can get to them. And I just want to say thanks to everybody for being here. And Joanne, I'll let you take it away.
I will. As always, we are now going to segue into the after party. Anyone who is new, we are now going to turn off the recording, where you're not going to record anymore, so that we could be a little freer and easier in our conversation. If you have beamed in through the website, ncheteach.org/conversations, just stay here. And I know it's on the bingo card, it has to be on the bingo card, and I have to say it, and poof, we will become the after party right here. If you are on Facebook, watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and come in to the after party through ncheteach.org/conversations. As always, I thank you for being here. I thank you for taking part in the conversation of democracy every week. Every week we do this 83 times. that means something. And no matter how many of us gather here, the fact that we are gathering here and having this kind of conversation is important. So I wish you all have a wonderful week. I will see you in a week for our 84th episode. And I'll see you guys soon. For those sticking around, here is our segue, the end of the recording and the voice, and we will shift into the after party for freer conversation.